Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a moment of absolute crisis from the ancient world, found right in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 21. We're going to break down what happens when a kingdom is on the very brink of collapse, and its king makes one last, desperate call for help.
So let's set the scene. I want you to picture this. It's 588 BC. You've got the superpower of the age, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and they have Jerusalem completely surrounded. The siege is just relentless, supplies are gone, and inside those city walls, you can feel the desperation turning into despair. So in the middle of all this chaos, King Zedekiah, who's facing the total annihilation of his entire kingdom, sends this high-level team to the prophet Jeremiah, and he has just one single, urgent question for God. And you got to pay attention to who Zedekiah sends. This isn't just some random messenger. Verse 1 tells us he sends Pashur, a top royal official, and Zephaniah, the priest. I mean, this delegation represents the full power of both the palace and the temple. This just screams desperation, right?
Then, in verse 2, we get the king's plea. He's basically begging Jeremiah, go ask God for a miracle. We need a divine intervention to push back this Babylonian army. He's desperately hoping for a repeat of history, a last-minute rescue from the heavens.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Zedekiah's hope is totally misplaced. He's thinking back to a time like 701 BC, when God really did miraculously save the city from the Assyrians. But that's the problem. He's completely ignoring the new reality on the ground. Ever since 605 BC, when Babylon just crushed Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, they've been the undisputed superpower. Zedekiah wants this divine get-out-of-jail-free card, but he's not offering any genuine change of heart.
So what does Jeremiah do? Well, he doesn't pray for them. He doesn't even try to negotiate. Instead, starting in verse 3, he drops a bombshell, a direct and terrifying revelation from God that's about to turn everything they thought they knew completely upside down.
And this message kicking off in verse 4 is just absolutely shocking. God declares that their own weapons won't just fail them, they're going to be turned against them. He says all their defenses are going to become useless as the enemy just pours over the walls and brings the fight right into the heart of Jerusalem.
And verse 5, wow, this is the heart of the reversal. God declares he is no longer their divine defender. In fact, he is now their main opponent in this war. He takes that classic language of deliverance, the outstretched hand and strong arm that once saved Israel from Egypt, and completely flips it. He's redirecting it against his own people. This is it. This is the ultimate terrifying price for breaking their covenant. The very God who promised to protect them is now leading the attack.
Okay, so here's a key term you need to know. When verse 4 mentions the Chaldeans, it's a specific reference to the ruling ethnic and political class of the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. Think of it as the geopolitical name for the enemy at the gates.
Then, verse 6 lays out the judgment. And it's brutal. It's not just one thing, it's this cascade of disasters. First, the sword from the attack. Then, the famine that comes from a long siege. And finally, pestilence, disease, that's going to run wild in an overcrowded, starving city. This is the exact fulfillment of ancient warnings that this is what happens when you turn your back on the covenant.
All right, so the prophecy then zooms in like a camera lens, moving from the fate of the entire city right down to a direct and personal verdict against King Zedekiah himself. It gets personal.
And what's incredible about verse 7 is that this prophecy came true with just chilling accuracy about 2 years later, in 586 BC. Jeremiah said Zedekiah would be captured, shown no mercy, and taken to Babylon. And we know from history that's exactly what happened. He was caught trying to escape, was forced to watch his own sons executed, and then he was blinded and dragged to Babylon in chains, where he died. The authority behind these words was just absolute.
Okay, so now the focus of the message pivots. It shifts away from the king and toward the ordinary people who are trapped inside Jerusalem's walls. And God offers them a choice, but it's a shocking choice, one that must have sounded like straight-up treason.
The language here in verse 8 is so powerful. It's a direct echo of the original covenant language given to Israel centuries earlier in Deuteronomy. You see, even in this moment of certain doom, God is still presenting a choice. This isn't a choice to save the nation anymore. It's a choice to save your own skin.
So what's the choice? What are the options? Well, verse 9 lays it out, and it is brutal and totally counterintuitive. The way of death is to stay loyal, to stay in the city, to resist, to fight. The way of life, it's to go out and surrender to the enemy.
Think about that. Resisting Babylon is now rebellion against God. Surrendering is obedience, and the only prize you get is to live.
And this is the crucial point, right here. While individuals could choose to survive, the fate of the city as a whole, that was already decided. Verse 10 leaves no room for doubt. God has set his face against Jerusalem, and it will be captured and burned with fire. The judgment is absolutely final.
You know, this whole chapter really becomes a case study of a leader whose choices guaranteed this exact disaster. So let's just take a quick look at King Zedekiah's track record. So get this, Zedekiah was actually installed as a puppet king by Nebuchadnezzar himself. But he was always plotting, always trying to rebel, looking for an alliance with Egypt to come save him. He completely ignored Jeremiah's repeated warnings to just submit to Babylon's authority. And in the end, instead of leading his people, he tried to flee his own city by night. His reign marks the tragic end of the line of David ruling from Jerusalem. Bottom line, he was a king who always chose politics over the prophet's words, and it sealed his fate and the fate of his entire kingdom.
And all of this leaves us with one last, really provocative question that this chapter forces us to think about. When God's judgment is locked in, when the walls are coming down and the verdict is already final, what does being obedient even look like? For the people of Jerusalem, it looked like surrender, and that is a difficult truth for a desperate time.